Morning, Al.
Hi, Tom. How are you?
I'm very good. Great. What are we going to talk about today, then?
Well, I've been thinking Donald Trump and Elon Musk. They put into the domain the whole issue about Department of Government efficiency. And Musk was brought in because of obviously his work with his own businesses. I think what he's bringing forward here, Trump and Musk, is really being brought into worldwide. What are we wasting? How much money are we wasting? And I think that's a really leadership issue. What's your view on that?
No, I think that's definitely something. If you think about the game that most businesses play, it's around profitability, it's around efficiency, and looking after their people. And of course, you can't look after people that way if you've got no funds to do that. It is a huge part of what the conversation needs to be about. And I guess in the past, where there's been access to fucking money, people as businesses generally have only survived, or a lot of the survival has been down to bringing cash in the form of investment, not actually creating any value within the business itself. So you can argue, are they really businesses? But this lack of, or this inability to bring funds in that means that people have got to look at the funds that they've got already and make better use of those funds.
Yeah, I think that whole topic is really interesting because the word that we're going to use for this is NVA, non-value-added activities. And organisations are actually fuller of them than they'd like to think. There's a lot of activities that take place that don't add any value to what they do. They add costs. In fact, they inflate costs. They reduce profitability, but they can do other things, such as in terms of production, mean the wrong things are produced or they're badly produced. So it is a big topic, and billions are what the Americans are considering to be wasted. And in the UK, our own government is now getting down to looking at this issue, what is being wasted. So really, how many organisations are wasting money through lots of non-value-added activities?
And so typically, have you got any sort of feel for, from your research, what would an average business, I mean, our listeners could be anything from big organisations to tiny, but any sort of feel for how the size of that?
Yeah, research into this over the last sort of 15, 20 years has concluded that about 30% of non-value-added activities in organisations. Doesn't necessarily mean 30% of the top line, but it can be 30% of your overhead costs, labour costs, etc. That's a lot of money for some people. I mean, the history of this goes all the way back to Toyota post the Second World War. Toyota at the time were amongst many other Japanese businesses. There wasn't money, simply. So they couldn't go and borrow. So it's how could we be more efficient with the money we've got? And they came up over the years with what's known as the Toyota production system, which became the father of lean. And lean is one way of looking at NVA, agile might be another, but just simply thinking about NVA in leadership terms, these are things that come down to such things as how much time do you spend in meetings, that don't have any decent outcomes that are going to change things. How much time is now being consumed in doing emails? Interestingly, we did some research with one organisation, and out of an average day, these people said they were spending, these are leaders, 3 hours a day on emails. Well, if the working day is 7 hours, 3 7ths is an awful lot. They also then worked longer hours, so actually they had time poverty. So, when you start to add this up, this organisation was wasting an awful lot of money.
So ultimately, how do you get rid of it?
You have to sit down and be determined. And of course, this is where Musk is getting criticised, because is he just making people redundant, closing departments without doing research? But it's actually quite easy in most organisations to ask people where they're spending their time. And if you recall, he controversially got told what those 5 questions, because he asked people 5 questions. What did you do last week? List me these 5 things. Yeah, criticised because they were civil servants who no one ever questioned before. But if you're running an organisation, have you ever done an audit on yourself? Where is your time going? Is it adding value in your business or is it not? And in fact, many leaders are actually creators of MBA themselves.
Mm.
And I think, this is where people have to take a long, hard look at themselves and say, am I adding value or am I actually creating non-value added activities?
Sometimes you wonder whether people understand even what value means. And who is it value to your company, your shareholders, or value for your customers or the marketplace? So even that whole concept of value and the value stream and how we create value is one that has to be had as well before you even start to look at non-value added activities.
Absolutely. I think, people say, well, is this new? Well, there was a chap called Northcott Parkinson.
Okay. Parkinson's law.
Yeah. Parkinson's law, yeah. But actually, what Parkinson's law is actually very appropriate at this moment because we're talking about civil servants. What Parkinson basically concluded is that people, time fills up to meet what people think is work. So people create work for each other. And Parkinson's law was the multiplication of this. So if you were a manager, you had sort of three choices. You could recruit someone else, but they may become your enemy, or you could recruit two people, and those two people obviously weren't your enemy, they were your subordinates. Because they then wanted this, and he concluded that one person, before too long, had created a job for seven. Well, that's an awful lot of salaries. So challenging, have we overgrown? Are we too fat? Lots of organisations do that, but they don't understand exactly where people's time goes. And that comes back to, I'm afraid, Musk again, who asked those 5 questions.
Mm.
A lot of people didn't like it because they'd never been asked it before. But if you're running a business, those 5 questions could be quite important. So I'm not going to go into what he asked, but there could be questions that you could ask people.
That would be our recommendation, and I'm thinking out loud here, but if you sit down with questions like that, we've been doing workshops with people, we've had a whole list of 10, 12, 15 different typically non-value added activities, haven't we?
Yeah, of which one, interestingly enough, is the leader themselves. And it is interesting that 70% of people consider leaving a job because they don't like their leader. They don't think they do the right job. And in fact, just under 50% then leave. So leaders themselves can be a big contributor to MBA.
I think my own profession from construction, if you think about the value stream, let's just take a really simple example. If you're making building in construction, it's the girls and boys who are pouring concrete, fixing steel, doing the actual work itself that are creating the value for the client, for the company, and whatever price per cubic metre of concrete or how much steel tonnage you fix or whatever. You could argue that all the rest of the company has to support that. But in many senses, it's almost the other way around. It's a very top-down thing, and every layer above the people are actually generating what will be ultimately invoiced.
But you see, although they're doing the job, it's quite interesting because if one looks at construction, for instance, there's an awful lot of wastage of materials. Materials are in the air, and also mistakes are made, so you don't have to do rework and things like that. These are all the sort of things that Toyota looked at. It's quite interesting that Toyota don't believe in having cars sitting in a showroom unsold. So when you've gone to go and buy a Lexus or Toyota, you're told, well, it's 3 to 6 months before you get it. I know that because I've recently bought one. And the answer is stock costs money. And, so holding stock costs money. Interesting. Lots of organisations hold stocks. You could be a wholesaler or whatever. Are you carrying too much? Have you got the right sort of things? Is the market changing on you? So being ahead of the game and thinking, it's all very well to be stocked, but have I got the right stuff? And so supply chain is really important. So what non-value added activities take place in the supply chain?
So is it possible to be too lean? In an age where we have of uncertainty, and you're starting to see that. You know, the supply chains are so fine tuned. And I think you've shown examples in the retail sector or the food. You know, they're so fine tuned, so lean that if there's any slight break in that chain, they're brittle and there's challenges. I mean, I guess some people are more down that end of the spectrum, others are nowhere near that. But are there any sort of downsides of
Being too lean.
being too lean?
Of course there are. And of course you can make mistakes. I mean, the great thing with Toyota, coming back to them, is a trip to one of their factories shows you that things are coming in just in time. So, for instance, if you have a traffic jam around parts of one of their factories and it doesn't get there in time, your production line closes. So yeah, it is fine lines, and you've got to be careful and getting a balance. But that's about knowing your business. So, you know, how many leaders really know their business? You know, from my experience, there are a lot of people at the top of organisations, the top leaders, have no idea what goes on in their businesses.
Mm.
And you know, we had in this country a famous store, Marks and Spencer's, still doing quite well. But the last family member, Marcus Seith, where did he spend his time?
It was on the shop floor, wasn't it?
On the shop floor. He said, I'm basically a shopkeeper. So I may be at the top of my organisation, but I need to be on the shop floor, speaking with my customers, speaking with my staff. Now, he used to do 3 days out of 6, because Marks and Spencer's originally never opened 7 days a week. So I wonder, you know, was that a good value of his time? Well, profits under him were very good. They slipped after it moved. So you could argue, as a shopkeeper, he took a shopkeeper's mentality to running a business. Now, you know, you look at other businesses, some chief executives are never seen. Do they know their businesses?
Well, I think that yeah, you got some of their business, they're making probably more money or losing more money on the stock markets than they are actually in the business itself. You know, and I think that's a different kind of business. If you're a listed business or a family-run business, or you know, I think. But you're right. A lot of these leaders have become more out of touch than they perhaps realise.
Yeah, an NVA is costing you money. So you know, if it's 30%, so your overheads, and you know your overheads are 10 million, and you could save 3 million of that. How much of that goes not just into profit, but how much of that cuts your borrowing costs? You know, borrowing costs are high these days. You know, the old days of 0.5% interest have gone. You know, it could be a long while before interest rates drop. So, thinking how much of our cash flow are we just frittering away, not just our profits, but you know, it's a really important thing to think about.
Yeah. So I suppose as we sort of start to draw an end to this conversation, what are we sensing? What tasks do leaders need to do? I mean, if this is a dysfunction of a leader.
What is it a dysfunction? I believe it is. I think, you know, in terms of leading, you have to think about your people, and you also have to think about your costs, and you have to think about your role in both of those. So I think it is a dysfunction if you're not actually thinking about non-value-adding activities. What's your...
No, I do, and I think I mean the sort of model that I have in my mind is that there are some key levers, if you like, that a leader has to have their hand on. One of which is consumption. You know, and that conversation that you have with yourself and your team around consumption is for me, it's a weekly conversation. Consumption. I devote 1 hour a week to looking at that and just thinking, okay, what is it? And how much waste is there? And often the flip side is that often waste can become a really it can become a new business venture. You look at what you're wasting and think, actually, that could be, I can flip that around. If you look at a lot of businesses, they looked at what's coming out, if it was a factory, what's coming out the other end that you throw away, actually turns out to be incredibly valuable. So it's actually a really positive conversation you can have with people as to what are we wasting, how can we redeploy all of that somewhere else? So it doesn't mean to say we're going to get rid of people or make them redundant. You know, often you realise that they're doing meaningless things, and actually those people there could be deployed in a much more useful way, and your business can expand. So it is a really positive thing, in my experience.
Well, take the example we had of the client where they're actually reporting, on average, they're spending 3 hours a day on emails. So, you've got 100 managers spending 300 hours. So if you could reduce that to 200 hours, what's the cost of that 100 hours?
Yeah.
A week. A week. A very measurable amount of money. Meetings that they were having as well, that had too many people going, so there was a lack of trust. So trust is an interesting thing to look at with MBA. What's our level of trust like? The lower the trust is, the more likely you'll get to get more MBA, because there's double markings, all sorts of things going on between people.
Yeah.
So we start to look at this organisation was just full of MBA that could be quickly reduced.
Yeah, and quite quickly you can start to see some real benefits of that. At least that your staff go home on time, which is used.
Well, that was the other thing. These people were working not 7 hours a day, but 10 hours a day. Because they were having to work longer to do their job. I mean, one firm I worked with, simply 80% of the manager's time was spent in meetings. They had no time to spend with their people at all. They went from one meeting to another. Without those meetings really contributing too much to profitability, but in themselves generating a huge amount of non-value added activity.
So that's the when push comes to shove, go to the diary of a leader, look at the diary as a bit of an audit, if you like, and look at it all, look at the activities that are in there, and look at what value each of those activities actually makes and for who. And then just start the process of, sorting it out. What would that diary need to look like if it was to be a more functional leader?
And go on beyond that and say, look, I've called this meeting. There's 8 people coming. So that's 8 hours. So if a meeting lasts an hour, how much does an hour cost?
Yeah.
Research is showing that even if you get lower sort of supervisor levels together, you're talking 4 figures simply for a meeting. Is it necessary? Is it adding value? So when you call a meeting, ask yourself, does this meeting need 8 people? Does it need to be an hour? If we have clear objectives of what we're trying to achieve, and we come out of it with some goals at the end, we're hopefully cutting MBA.
Yeah, absolutely. Good. I think we've probably started the ball rolling. We've let the cat out of the bag.
Yeah.
Hopefully people will start to have that much more in mind, that this is a real issue. There could be 30% or more of waste sitting there ready to be tackled.
And on the bottom here, there's a little poll here, so you can give us your view on it, and we can feed back to you what the level of MBA from our listeners actually is considered to be.
Yeah, that'd be really interesting. Look forward to looking at the data. They always say that without the data, you're just an opinion. But it's going to be really interesting. This is something that what we've really believed in is evidence-based conversations. And how do you take, you can have a hunch that something's going on in your business, but fill in the form, look at it all, and start this journey if you haven't already. I'm sure many people have. But there's probably an awful lot more to get out of this topic.
Oh, yeah.
And, we look forward to sharing with you what we hear back from all of our listeners. Thank you.
Thanks for your time.